Everything in physiology follows the rule that too much can be as bad as too little. There are optimal points of allostatic balance. Robert M. Sapolsky, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
Welcome to the Thrivology Lab podcast, where we explore the science, philosophy, and practice of thriving. Our goal is to help you create a happier and healthier life through education, application, and transformation. Your co-hosts on this journey are Neil Utterback, that's me.
And Phil Dunwoody, that's me. Neil and I are both on the faculty at Juniata College, where we teach courses to promote human thriving and well-being. Before we get started, Neil, where can people find us?
Subscribe to the Thrivology Lab on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment or question on YouTube, and we will be sure to respond. And be sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and also LinkedIn. And you can also reach out to us via questions or comments at thrivologylab@gmail.com.
All right, so today's topic, we're talking about stress and the body. What is stress? What are the impacts of stress on the body? And the opening quote, everything in physiology follows the rule that too much can be as bad as too little. There are optimal points of allostatic balance. This is from Robert M. Sapolsky's book. It's a classic, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. I think it was first published in, 1999 maybe, but it's been updated several times. I think to understand stress, a good place to start is evolution, which is very much how Sapolsky looks at this, certainly how I look at it as a psychologist. And because you can't really understand stress without understanding it as an evolved response by animals to address challenges in their environment. So the first thing, our bodies at any given point have a limited amount of energy that they can use. And when there's an immediate stressor, an immediate energy requirement, our bodies divert energy from some areas and essentially marshal that energy to be used in other places. So immediate physical needs in an emergency then basically take priority over longer-term things like reproduction, digestion, sex, anything that involves future planning. If there's an immediate emergency, there's no future planning. You have to survive the emergency, right? And your body stress response works wonderful for this. So think of it this way. Imagine you're a zebra on the Serengeti, and a lot of your life is calm. You hang out in your dazzle. I had to look up.
Can we just pause a second?
I had to look up dazzle.
That is a fabulous little tidbit.
Yes. You have gaggles, you have troops.
A dazzle of zebras.
A dazzle of zebras.
That's fantastic.
Because they are dazzling, right? Yeah. I mean, so you and your dazzle hang out, and you eat, and you mate, and you, of course, digest food, and you grow, and, all these things that require energy and really kind of long-term energy output. Of course, zebras are also going to chronically be on the lookout for predators. Lions, hyenas, leopards, cheetahs, these are real predators that the zebra faces in their environment. And the moment you spot one, your threat system, one, you're constantly scanning for threats as a zebra and us today. It's just something that's built into all animals. And the moment you spot something that you perceive as a potential threat to you, your body makes automatic adjustments, and the level of the threat has something to do with this too. So if you think like, wow, that lion or tiger or whatever it is coming at me to eat me, your body's going to have a dramatic stress response. It's going to divert energy from every long-term system so that energy can be available for immediate use in the muscles. And this makes total sense in that scenario. So that means energy is diverted from growth systems, sexual reproduction systems, food digestion, and even parts of the brain that use a lot of energy essentially get inhibited. They get less blood flow. You're going to not sleep. Your sleep system is essentially going to be put on hold because, again, sleeping in an emergency is a bad idea. You might need to survive a threat that lasts a day or two, right? So you might need to kind of temporarily, even though sleep is so important, we did a whole episode on sleep in terms of how that helps heal the body and how essential that is for health and longevity. If you can't survive the immediate emergency, the long term doesn't matter. So all these things get compromised, these long-term things get compromised to feed your muscles. And then the zebra either survives the threat and returns to normal resting state with the dazzle, or it dies. Right? And so this is the evolved context. And it's the evolved context for not just zebras, but primates, broadly speaking, humans in particular. It's a stress response system that is designed for a short-term stressor.
And maybe it's helpful, as I'm even listening to you outline this, making sort of a bullet of things that we're going to come back to, of this sort of chronic versus acute. But the other thing I think that's really important, that I think doesn't get as much maybe talk about, is that sort of default scanning. Like, I'm always sort of, right? And how that in our modern context may be getting hijacked by the world.
Again, in teaching psychology, I talk a lot about we're essentially hardwired to always be looking for threats and always be and sex. These are just basic survival as animals. You want to reproduce, you don't want to die. And so there's this concept. And you look, well, what's on the media? What's in movies? So we have, edge of your seat threatening things and lots of sexual scenes because they grab our attention. We can't help but notice them. And certainly, like, you look at political discourse, and now, in the U.S., Democrats and Republicans both describe each other as threatening to the country. Right? And the more you perceive another group as threatening, the more likely you are to actually support violence against that group because you see them as a genuine threat. And this is something my research actually looks at.
And I think that we're going to come back to this as well, but that perception can be changed, right? Like I can influence and change that perception, sometimes not for the better.
Yeah, and perception, it can be very different from reality.
Right.
Right. So you may be in a heightened state and perceiving threats all around you that actually aren't real. But either way, your body doesn't know the difference.
Your body doesn't know. Yep.
Right. And so, so we're not saying those things actually are always threatening, but you perceive them. That's what matters. Perception.
Our bodies are very wise, but kind of stupid.
Yeah. So this is the hunter, so for most of our existence, 300,000 years as a species, we existed as hunter-gatherers. And that meant that the types of problems we solved and the emergencies we were dealing with were these really short-term acute stressors. And we either survived the attack or we didn't. We got food or we didn't. And so you get this really kind of immediate feedback as to whether or not your behaviors are working and helping you attain your goals. You got sex, you survived the attack, you found food, or you didn't do those things. And this is very different from, I think, the context that we live in today, right? Which is an abstract, look at what you and I do. We push around electrons and, in terms of teaching and writing and doing things on computers. And in a very delayed, what one of my mentors in graduate school, Leonard Martin, developed what he called ID compensation theory. And it was about immediate need organisms living in delayed return economies. And what he meant by this is, again, going back to that hunter-gatherer existence, all those things we talked about for needs and emergencies, you either meet them or you don't, and it's relatively short term. You're not worried about whether you're going to have enough money for retirement.
Right.
Right? You're not worried about potential future layoffs for your employer, whether democracy is going to be around for the next presidential election. The number of things that we can worry about now, and then to even know if we're doing something right. So you pick a major in college, or first even do you go to college or do you not go to college? When do you find out if that's the right decision?
Yep. Yeah, and we're going to talk a second about decision making and how stressful just an activity that is, because it's not the menu of possibilities is far, far greater for us in a modern context.
Yes.
And, than it was, as a hunter-gatherer, you had fewer options.
Yeah, absolutely. And so part of that, right, this having essentially wired for kind of a more immediate feedback environment evolutionarily, but existing in a much more abstract social structure with, I'm saving for retirement and I'm thinking about 10 years out, and you can essentially have chronic stress, right? So we have this system that is meant to deal with emergencies and then be deactivated, but there's the potential now for it to be activated chronically. So why don't we talk more about kind of this acute versus chronic stress, or why zebras don't get ulcers?
Right. Right. So I think it's also important to remember, like, from a biological perspective, stress is anything that is changing your body's, the fancy word is homeostasis, sort of your balance. So if you're sitting down and somebody says stand up, from a biological perspective, that's stress, because you were sitting, now you're standing, the balance is now changed, right? That's pretty low stressor, but still, again, to your point, the body doesn't know. It's just degrees of stress. So homeostasis is the body's sort of desire, if you will, to sort of maintain its balance, right? Keeping all the systems in balance. And so I'll come back to that in a second, but Sapolsky points to another term that I think is more in alignment with stuff that we talk about, and that's allostasis, which is the body's, it's the process of that seeking balance. And you and I often talk about the difference between balance and balancing, that we are always in negotiation. Allostasis is talking about the world is constantly changing. I constantly have to adapt, even in small micro ways, to an ever-changing world. And so to some degree, homeostasis is, if we take the term quite literally, is kind of impossible because I'm always changing, right? And so but I'm always trying to keep those systems. And I think that this leads to our two sides of our autonomic nervous system, which is the sympathetic and parasympathetic. We've talked a bit about this in the past. Your sympathetic is your fight or flight, freeze. Your parasympathetic is your rest, digest, procreate, right? That's all in there. And from your nervous system perspective, when you can, for those who measure any kind of heart rate stuff, you can see the health of your autonomic nervous system show up in your what's called heart rate variability. So even though it's measuring your heartbeats, and you actually want irregularity in those. If it's too high and you're too stressed out, if it's too low, you're in sort of a depressed state. So a high heart rate variability, a greater degree of variability, actually is about those two sides, your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, sort of fighting for dominance. And that's actually what you want, because that's showing that they're both really healthy and doing that sort of allostatic work of balancing through that. So, I think also we talk, and we will continue to talk, and we often think maybe colloquially that stress is just bad. Stress is bad. I don't like it. I don't want it. But actually, stress, particularly acute forms of stress, are really beneficial, maybe even necessary for our overall health and well-being. So I think about this quote by tennis legend Billie Jean King, "Pressure is a privilege." And think about how a stressor can actually be advantageous for us. And there was a 2017 study by Cohn and Fernandez looking at possible ways in which stress could benefit, particularly sort of cognitive activity. So we often think, like, when I'm in a stressful state, the cognitive system defaults to sort of more primitive fight or flight stuff, and some of my executive function in the sort of prefrontal cortex gets shut down or limited. And that's certainly true, but there may be some nuance to that. And so they talk about how stress, acute stress, activates both these sort of slow and fast pathways in the brain in what is known as the salience network. And that network involves things like the amygdala. You may have heard us talk about the AMCC, the anterior mid-cingulate cortex again, when we're talking about doing hard things, the thalamus, the brainstem, and others. And so while some of the sort of more complicated executive function gets shut down in favor of these more sort of emotional and sort of physiological states, there's some other benefits that happen. So they took subjects in their 2017 study looking at Stroop-like tests. So in the sort of classic Stroop test, you have, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Phil, you have like a word red, but it's actually in green ink. Right, and you're asked what's the actual color, and so the text confuses you, and it takes a minute for your brain to reconcile what am I trying to do and what's the thing I'm seeing when these things are incongruent.
Yeah, absolutely. And the logic there is we've spent so much of our lives reading that reading is an automatic process. In other words, you can't help but read. And so even though you're told, name the color of the ink, in order to do that, you actually have to inhibit the reading. And so it takes longer to do that than if you were given either non-words with different colored ink, or if red is actually written in red. That's the easiest because then they're congruent.
And they looked at whether, to the degree to which stress influenced a Stroop-like test. So they showed people faces of happy or fearful emotional faces, and then the word in Dutch of happy or fearful, and those were either congruent or incongruent, matched or mismatched. And what they essentially found was and they had a time domain. Some in the control, they didn't have a time domain. They just had to figure it out. And then others had I can't remember exactly the time. They had to solve the problem in a matter of time. When they had the time pressure, they were slower but more accurate. So
interesting. So they did that trade-off.
Yeah, so it makes, again, I think that aligns with some of these other, our previous understanding that some of my cognitive effort is slowed because of these other more primitive brain structures, but it also makes evolutionary sense that I need to be accurate. Like if I have a spear and the thing in the woods could be a tiger or it could be my brother, I'd better be accurate before I throw the spear. I shouldn't just throw the spear because I could be my brother, right? So think about I've got to be on the alert and ready to go, but I have to be accurate about that as well.
Yeah, and that time pressure is a common way to simulate stress. I mean, just think about it from yourself. Remember when you've taken an exam and you had a limited amount of time and it didn't seem like enough? That just, you keep looking at your watch. Your performance can degrade there. You might work, and what I hear you saying in this case was they worked more slowly but more accurately. And this is something we see in general in human performance, that quality and quantity are trade-offs, right? And so you can think about in all of our jobs, and sometimes this is a source of stress. When you get too many things on your plate, your quality starts to degrade, right? You have, at that point, you have to choose, okay, I can get all of these things done and do a crappy job, or I can get some of them done and do a really good job. Which one is preferable? And I know in my own, job situations, when I've had too much work to do, I don't want to do a crappy job. I take pride in my work. That really bugs me. And so it causes me stress to feel like I've got too much to do well, and I don't like it, right? I want to do less and I want to do a good job at it.
It's just a slight sort of counterpoint nuance to that as well. We were just talking before we came online, in the kind of theater I do, it's often what we call devised. So the students or the actors are put into groups, and then a director or a teacher, somebody gives them a task with a bunch of different things they have to get in the task that they have to complete, but there's often the pressure of time, what one of my teachers, Ann Bogart, calls exquisite pressure to accomplish the task. And one of the tricks is you have to give the actor too much in too little time for them to attack the problem. And sometimes, like when there isn't sufficient pressure, and again, to your point, time is it's a quick pressure that we have always available to us. Like without that pressure, things don't get done. So I know for myself, I am a chronic procrastinator, left to my own devices. And what that actually caused was tremendous stress because I was not getting things done. So what I had to do was create this added front-loaded stress of a time domain for things. So even if I don't have an external deadline, I have to make myself a deadline. And it has to be a little faster, a little harder than it ought to be so that I get off my butt and get the job done. And I see that in the students as well with these theater projects. And so we've talked. Yeah, go for it.
Stress isn't always bad. I hear
stress isn't always
right?
bad.
So this goes back to that opening quote that in nature, essentially in physiology, that too little of something can be just as bad as too much of something. And we see this with the stress response system in your body as well. Underactivation and overactivation are associated with disease. And
one of the things I think also, this also comes from Sapolsky, is the stressor can be external and it also can be internal, right? That from Sapolsky's book, here's a quote: "A stressor is anything in the outside world that knocks you out of homeostatic balance. A stressor can also be the anticipation of that happening." And of course, it wouldn't be a Thrivology Lab podcast if I didn't have one Stoic philosophy quote. This comes from Seneca: "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." And the point here is that so many of our stressors are anticipations or predictions of the world. And a cognitive scientist that I really like, Andy Clark, one of his recent books, Surfing Uncertainty. I don't like it just because it has surfing in the title.
Oh, come on. Yes, you do.
But he talks about, like, we are essentially prediction machines. We go through the world trying to constantly make predictions based on history of things that have happened and our sort of analysis of the possibilities of things that could happen. That this sort of what he calls predictive processing, where we're constantly updating the models of the world, of what is, what happens, what could be. And so much of that is sort of in that sort of prediction is all imagined, right? And so we're taking in sensory data from the outside world and trying to say, what do I think this is going to happen? And if we are either sort of nature or nurture prone to more negative outcomes, we tend to not only see the world through that negative lens, but we also can even sometimes create the problem that wasn't even there.
This is one of the things we see with as part of the stress response. When we perceive a threat, that kicks the amygdala kind of into high gear, and we then become hyper vigilant for other threats. And so it can be this kind of self-perpetuating.
Right.
I perceived a threat. Maybe it was real. Maybe not. Maybe it was real but exaggerated. Whatever. We perceived the threat. That makes it more likely for me to perceive other things as a threat. And so, and of course, that's just going to feed on itself. And so, you can wind up in this really kind of chronically hyper-vigilant, stressed state.
And some of those predictions, as we've talked about before, like, my reality is largely based on what I perceive the reality. And some of that perception is based on my predictive capacity. Like, what do I think is going to happen? Why do I think that thing's going to happen? And how much do I get caught in that sort of feedback loop?
And in fascinating, it's not just prediction, it's actually also memory.
Right.
So if you induce like happy or sad moods in people by having them watch movie clips of happy and sad scenes, and then ask them to write down memories about their childhood, randomly assigning them to a happy or a sad movie impacts the availability of past memories. So your current mood, if you're fearful, apply this to fear. If I'm fearful, I'm actually going to be more likely to remember fearful episodes in my past than if I'm feeling secure and safe, in which case then I'm going to be more likely to remember. So it's almost like your current state changes your history as well as your prediction.
Well, and that makes me think like so much of stress often feels like we feel out of control. Like I'm stressed out because I don't feel like I have control. And I think going back to that, like Stoic first principle of divide amongst things that which you have and have not in your control. If it's not in your control, put it to the side. Don't worry about it. If it's in your control, take control of it. And I think that's also what I hear. Like, how can we curate our lives in such a way that we're also fueling the right outcome in so many ways?
Yeah, for sure. And this is, we talked about anxiety briefly ahead of this. And, that's one of reaction to perceiving a stress and worrying about, let's say you're worried about layoffs. And of course that could make you anxious, but it might motivate you to update your resume. You might be taking classes, to kind of update your skill set. And so that anxiety it can be a useful problem-solving approach. At some point, that anxiety is actually debilitating. So again, there's this optimal level at which a little bit of it is actually probably good. If you don't care, you're not motivated to do anything.
Well, I know for myself, just personally, I'll just say this publicly, like my finances have not been like, have been sort of a background thing for me. I haven't sort of taken proactive initiatives to sort of take control of my retirement or any of those other things. It hasn't really been a stressor for me. But as we move into a more complicated economic world, political world, I was like, maybe rather than just worrying about that I could get fired or the world, like, let me start taking some control of my finances such that I alleviate that fear.
Yeah, and I think as we age, it becomes more concrete too. Like retirement, right. 20 years ago, retirement, what's that? And now that I'm 51, I'm like, oh,
okay,
that's not as far away,
right,
hypothetically, as it was before.
Right.
So yeah, it seems more concrete. But yeah, prediction machines, often I've heard people describe the human brain as a simulation machine as well, right? Because it's for problem solving. Right. And that's part of how we, worrying about an upcoming conversation, we all do this. We'll practice a conversation, and that's exactly what it is. It's practice.
Yep.
So that when you get there, you have a better idea of what you might say. So this, we're saying, again, stress isn't necessarily good or bad. It can be either one. The effects of chronic stress are where I think some of the negative aspects can really come in, right? And, just to be clear, underactivation and overactivation are both associated with disease, right? So when we talk about chronic stress, we're talking about the overactivation part. When the underactivation part, you do have underactivation of the body's stress response system is associated with chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and other diseases. I mean, so there's a whole kind of area of stress physiology that looks at both sides of this, and that's what Sapolsky is referring to in that opening quote. When we talk about the chronic activation of our stress response system, there's a nice kind of summary by Crusos. The paper is called Stress and Disorders of the Stress System. And just some of the systems that are impacted by the stress response system: arousal and sleep, which we already mentioned, right? And we know this personally. When I'm stressed, even though I don't feel like super stressed, I'm much more likely to be up at 3 or 4 in the morning, lying in bed, thinking I should go back to sleep. But my mind is busy, right? And that's that background level of chronic stress. That's a sign, if you're having that you probably have some background level of chronic stress. Metabolism, right? The whole, again, kind of digesting food for later use doesn't make sense if your body thinks there's a short-term emergency. And so, but to be happy and healthy, you need your gastrointestinal system to function well. Your metabolism is going to operate differently under a perceived threat, immediate stress that is being then chronically activated. Because we don't have a separate, and I think this is really key to understand, we don't have separate systems for acute stressors and chronic stressors. If we did, we might not have the health problems we do from chronic stress, because the acute stress response is very well designed for short-term activation, and it degrades the body when it's activated long-term, right? And so that's what we see with chronic stress. We know it degrades the immune system, right? So you're more likely to get sick. Chronic stress at work is often what we call burnout, right? And this symptoms of burnout often include, kind of this feeling, this lack of efficacy at work, like what I do doesn't matter. When you get home, you may feel drained, like you've got no energy to do anything else. So there's these, sometimes bitterness comes out toward work then as well, or indifference. So there's, burnout is essentially chronic stress in a work environment, workplace environment.
Yeah. And like, I think sometimes we think that chronic stress or stuff is just all in my head, but like the stressor, those impacts that you're talking about across physiological, neurological, immune system, mental health, gastrointestinal, like all of those are also mediated by sort of the chemical cocktail that's getting released in the body. So this comes from like Mariotti 2015 article, The Chronic Effects of Chronic Stress on Health, New Insights into the Molecular Mechanism of Brain-Body Communication. So like the whole system, things like stress hormones and mediating chemicals like norepinephrine, adrenaline, or cortisol is a big one. Cortisol is sort of the stress hormone we often think of, but like it's not supposed to be circulating chronically through the body, and when it does, it can degrade all kinds of functionality, including like neurological impacts, like your memory, as you said, gets impacted by that, immune system dysfunction. And so the things that start emerging out, like, I just feel sort of sick to my stomach, I feel a little bloated, I feel like lethargic, I just feel like all those things are also predicated on some of these chemicals that are getting released. So some of what we're doing is sort of like bartending a little bit with the body, and we've got the wrong cocktail sometimes.
Yeah, and the burnout, the conditions at work that can cause that chemical cocktail that degrades your body. There's a good bit of research on it, and relationships with colleagues are a big one. If you have negative relationships with people in the workplace, especially a supervisor, that is experienced as a chronic stressor. If you regularly have too much to do, what we call unrealistic work demands, that's a chronic stressor. If you feel unappreciated, that is experienced as a chronic stressor. And so there's a good bit of research on kind of what things in a work environment, or in any relationship to some extent, right? This kind of appreciation, too much parents, but with young kids often feel this kind of chronic stress of, there's all these unrealistic work demands. And then chronic stress results in, what we see is cardiac disease is the #1 killer in the U.S., right? And cardiac disease is at least largely the impact of hypertension, of chronic stress, right? So that increases your risk of stroke, heart attack, and so these are huge societal risks that have really big costs. And I think often we as individuals, we as a society, and in our workplaces don't recognize just how toxic they can be. And again, I don't want to play into the, no, all stress is bad, because we've said that's not the case. But a high level of chronic stress, yes, that's bad.
And how some of that too is like both external and internal. So you can think about those, you have a meeting with a colleague you don't get along with at 12 o'clock, but at 11 you've already started anticipating that meeting, and you've already worked yourself up, and then an hour or two after the meeting you're still ruminating on that thing. So what was an hour-long meeting now has become a 3+ hour experience, right? And then you've got the next thing, and then the next thing, and the next thing. So, we talk in the mindfulness section about the ability to let go. Mm-hmm. And so in so many ways, the mindfulness stuff we're talking about along all of these podcasts, it seems, right, is it could actually save your life, right? The ability to let go of some of this. You're talking about like that the chronic stress is leading to chronic disease like cardiovascular disease. 1 in 5 deaths in America. Like that's huge. That's a huge number. And I'm not saying that mindfulness is the panacea. I'm not saying like that's the get out of jail free card. But like as we think about our sort of stress environments and the degree to which we have this, what are the things I can do to intercept those? Yeah,
news consumption, right? It's a good example of that. And that, like, I very much want to be updated about what's going on in the world. I read the New York Times daily. I listen to NPR. I try not to do those things in the evening because I know I won't sleep as well. Especially with this a lot of political turmoil right now in the U.S. We're seeing kind of an attack on our democracy, and that's actually what I research, and so I find that stressful, right? I think a lot of us do. But I don't want to exist in that state of constant. Like I know it's bad for my body, and so I have to kind of be aware, but like you say, also try and let go.
Yeah,
and it's hard.
We've talked in the sort of do hard things about sort of the importance of discipline. And I think part of that discipline is also about setting boundaries for ourselves. And we see this with students, like when we talk in our Ways of Wellbeing class, like social media, setting boundaries, like how much time. I'm not saying you can't go on social media. Maybe just do it an hour instead of 4 hours a day. You can watch the news. Maybe I do 30 minutes instead of an hour, or like whatever it is, like setting boundaries for ourselves. And those boundaries are going to be different for every individual, but like setting the boundaries such that you can get the thing you need, but then you're not, to Sapolsky's point, too little or too much, right?
Yeah. So I come away with this from this podcast with kind of 2 take-home things that I think of. One is this important differentiation between acute and chronic stress, right? And that like when I work out at the gym,
right,
I'm self-inflicting an acute stressor that is actually going to be good for me,
right?
I hope, if I don't hurt myself, right? And to some extent, when I practice mindfulness and relaxation techniques, I'm trying to essentially be aware of this background level of chronic stress. So differentiating between this acute and chronic stressor, I think is key, right? Acute stressors in moderation are actually really good for your body and promote growth. Chronic stressors, especially a high level of chronic stress, is really, really dangerous, right? High blood pressure and all the complications it comes with. And then with any level of stress, thinking about what in psychology is called the Yerkes-Dodson law. And it's this relationship between performance and stress. And we've already hit on the idea of it. And it's that, if I've talked with my students about this, if you don't care about your performance in class and your grade, you're probably not going to do very well, right? You're not going to be motivated to study. Some amount of stress actually helps performance, right? You're gonna read the material. You're going to study. You're going to hopefully get a good night's sleep before the exam. I know many of them binge study instead, but too much stress is going to degrade performance. And so the Yerkes-Dodson law refers to this inverted U that is the relationship between performance and stress. And so that if your stress is really, really low, your performance is not good because you don't care. And then as it increases, your performance increases, right? You're motivated to do well. But you hit a tipping point. Mm-hmm. And that's when you start to go down because too much stress then starts to inhibit performance. And this is exactly what Sapolsky is talking about with physiology in the body as well, in that when we look at the stress system and its relationship to disease, too little activation of the stress system is associated with disease, as is too much.
And what I just find it fascinating, like that is true for virtually every human thing. Like to your exercise point, too little, bad. Too much, bad. Mm-hmm. Food, too little, bad. Too much, bad. Yeah. Sleep, too little, bad. Too much. Right? It's just like we have to find, and that's that sort of allostasis, that like find the balancing and that sweet spot that may change for us from time to time. And stress is no different.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this week your challenge, one, seek out an acute stressor that will be good for you, that will promote growth. For me, it's gym. I've been trying to do the gym more and do more weight-bearing activities. But you pick one for yourself. And then secondarily, try and evaluate your baseline level of chronic stress. And if blood pressure is a kind of, one, it's a sign of aging, so it is related to just wear and tear on the body physically, but also a sign of chronic stress. If you have digestive problems and you tend to find yourself being awake at 4 a.m. and not being able to sleep, you're seeing these symptoms of chronic stress. Think about that as kind of a signal that your body is sending. What can you change? What can you do differently that might help lower your level of stress? Because you'll actually be better at doing all the things in your life that you need to do.
And I would add to that thinking, like, if you don't already have a journaling practice, this might be a great time to pick one up, because I think for me, keeping a journal every day helps me track some of the common themes that I'm wrestling with over time. So if you keep finding that you're journaling about this problem, it keeps coming up, maybe it's time to address the problem a little bit.
Yeah, that regular reflection,
right?
You then I'm sensing a theme here.
Right? Why does this keep coming up?
I keep saying the same thing.
All right, that's it for this episode. Please subscribe to the Thrivology Lab on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment or question on YouTube, and we will be sure to respond. And be sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. If you have any questions or comments, or there's a subject you'd like to hear us discuss, please reach out to thrivologylab@gmail.com. Thrive on, friends.
Thrive on.